So over the last few days, Bernie, we've had some wonderful conversations, but one thing we didn't talk about is what we're going to talk about.
Right.
So we're going to wing it a little bit and start a conversation, and then invite you to join in, of course. I was just thinking, though, well, first of all, of course, I want to thank you for the masterly way of teaching you have, and the way you introduce people of all levels of knowledge into this mystical, the joys, the delight of this mystical wisdom. It's so important for our time. It reminded me of when I was a little boy, I persuaded my brother, my older brother, to teach me to swim. And he didn't want to be bothered with me, but he took me to the swimming pool, and his method was to push me in at the deep end. And so I can still remember sinking to the bottom and then learning to swim just as a matter of survival. And I think your gift is to push us in at the deep end without speaking down to us, or in any way being condescending or oversimplistic, but at the same time making it feel possible for people to swim in this great wisdom. So maybe the first thing I'd like to raise with you as a topic is something that came up yesterday. I forget who it was. The question of the word meditation. And you said that, of course, the word meditation covers a broad spectrum of meaning and different practices. I think that's vital, and one can use it in a more specific way as we do, but we need to remember it has that wider meaning as well. But in the way that we use, of course, the word meditation, John Main chose that word to describe what we teach and what he found in John Cassian, simply because it was the word that meant that to the great majority of people. Most people on the street today think of meditation more in terms of this apophatic laying aside of thoughts. I think it's Evagrius describes prayer as the laying aside of thoughts.
Yes, yeah.
More people think of it like that than they do of it as Lectio or as a more discursive kind of meditation. So I was wondering whether how if you could say something about that specific, aspect of the meaning of meditation, in which Cassian says we abandon or renounce all the riches of thought and imagination and come with ready ease, this is the old translation, we come with ready ease to the first of the Beatitudes, to poverty of spirit. So how you pick up on that and how you see it resonating with other traditions. And if I could just add one other aspect to this question or this point. Cassian is writing the 10th conference, which I think many or most of the people here will be aware of. He's writing that in quite a controversial environment over the originist controversy. And he leaves out some of the details of that they lost the debate. And so. And he emphasizes very strongly, for that reason, that he was on this side of the argument. He emphasizes very strongly, as you mentioned the other day, that this was a tradition that was taught by the oldest of the Desert Fathers, who themselves learnt it from the Apostolic Fathers. So, and I think many of the people here who are sharing in the work of our community and teaching meditation will have found that on occasions. They will find that teaching prayer in this way, rather as you were describing through Meister Eckhart today, not petitionary prayer and so on, that is controversial. or it is confusing, or it is antagonizing to some people, just as it was, at the end of the 4th century. That seems to me to say something about the perennial nature of the mystical tradition in the church. But could you comment on that?
Well, I could say that by starting with at your last point, I mean, there's a certain sense in which meditation is natural, I think, to human nature. But that doesn't mean that we cannot learn how to use the natural capacity. So I think the idea of teaching meditation is crucial. And it's not that you're giving people something they didn't have the capacity for, but you're helping them to develop that capacity. And that's why I think meditation is very important as part of a teaching tradition. And for me, it is a broadly capacious word that would include both the positive and the negative aspects, both the cataphatic and the apophatic, and the way in which the monks, such as the people I was talking about, the other day, Guigo and the others. I mean, you work at meditation. You're working at it. You're putting in effort, and you're doing positive things, trying to understand a particular scriptural text. But that should be moving you on to a new level of insight, which may not need images and as much thinking as you approach the level of what he calls contemplatio, as you approach this level of simplification. The real process here is, I think, the process of simplification. You have to start out with effort and complex ideas and using different scriptures, but you're moving towards a greater simplicity in which a single thought or a single idea will encompass so many others. So you're moving in the direction of the apophatic. You're moving in the direction of a silence and a stilling. That, I think, is still a part of the meditative process, but that the monks I was talking about the other day would say is also the beginning of contemplation, in the sense that you're becoming less and less complex, and you're becoming more and more unified around particular insights that themselves become more and more simplified as they approach the divine nature. And I'd make one further comment on your initial story about being pushed into the deep end and learning how to swim. Let me use an image that first occurs in Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great, and I would apply it also to mysticism. Gregory the Great is applying it to Scripture and the infinite capacity, the wonderful capacity of Scripture to appeal both to the simple and to the complex. And he says that Scripture is a broad river in which lambs may wade and elephants may swim. Lambs may wade, that is, the simple will get enough out of Scripture and they can keep their feet on the ground, but it also is so wonderful and so rich and so deep that the elephants can swim in it. And I'd like to think that the mystical tradition has that aspect too. Many of these thinkers are very, very difficult, and they're all, I think, very profound, but they also can give us solid, simple truths for the lambs, so that the lambs can start to wade and eventually transform themselves into elephants and swim around in the depths of the mystical tradition.
Castian also says, I think you also quoted this, that one of the ways, he said, when we first began to pray in this way that Abbot Isaac told us, we thought, this is going to help us keep our minds focused, because we felt very distracted, and that worried us. And they almost felt that the state of distraction was like original sin. They couldn't get rid of it. So they were very happy to hear about the formula, the repetition of focusing the mind in this way. And then he said, then we discovered it was much more difficult than we had thought it was going to be. And then the next thing he says is but we realized fairly quickly that it was changing. Well, he doesn't say this, but he says it was changing us. And the first way he seemed to recognize us was in the way he read the scriptures. And he now said, he now says, we read them as if we were the author of them, and we could see into the very bones and marrow of scripture.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this kind of to and fro, really, between the almost between the two hemispheres of the brain, or the cataphatic and the apophatic. The way you know that you're growing in this apophatic way, even though it may be very difficult, is that you are, for example, able to read scripture in a new way.
Yeah, exactly. No, no, I think distractions are part of the mystical path and a part of the prayer path. I mean, Teresa of Avila is really wonderful on this, particularly if you read her life, because she tells us, and also it's in the interior castle as well. She tells us how distracted she was. She had a mind that seemed to lend itself to distraction, as she talks about herself. And so it was a very long learning process. And of course, it was the work of grace that enabled her finally to be able to concentrate her attentions. But she testifies to how difficult that was, and how even when she was a very experienced prayer, that there was still, the imagination would flit around with all sorts of images, and this continued to trouble her. But she finally learned to accept that that had its place in the whole process by which she learned eventually to arrive at the prayer of quiet, the prayer of union, etc. So their distractions in prayer are troubling, but I think they're part of the prayer life itself.
It's like the Desert Fathers would say, you're struggling until the end of your life, but if you didn't have the struggle, you wouldn't be growing.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
If you could spend a weekend, either, you could not with both, but you had to choose between Teresa or John of the Cross, who would you choose to spend it with?
I think I'd choose Teresa. And Teresa and John were very close friends, but she made fun of him because she said he was too serious. And she several places in her writings, then once there's this little writing where she talked about particular relationship between prayer of union and prayer of quiet, and she sent a letter to somebody and she wasn't there, so a number of her friends met. 10 or 12 of her friends met and wrote out responses to this issue, and they sent them to Teresa. And John wrote this very complicated theological one, and she said that, thank you, Father John, for giving an answer to a question I didn't ask.
Isn't there a description of John of the Cross being the life and soul of the party at some picnic? Remember that?
Well, there's something about his love for asparagus somewhere, which I think I remember when you think of this. John, as you read John of the Cross, and as you read about his life, he was a marvelous spiritual director. He was an extremely kind person, but he was also a very serious person. It didn't prevent him from being such an amazing spiritual director. And don't forget, John's writings that we have are basically the fruit of his advisees, mostly among sisters, who were reading his poetry. Poetry begins composing in prison. Then he brings out the poetry, deeply spiritual, and he's reading it to mostly sisters, also to some of the friars, and explaining it, and they're still having difficulty understanding it. So they ask him, can't you write out in prose, some explanations that will help us, especially if we don't have you there. And so that's the reason we have these 4 great treatises. They're really 3, but one splits into 2. We have these 4 great mystical treatises that really form a kind of summa of the mystical life. But at the beginning of those, particularly at the beginning of the spiritual canticle, he says, this is just one explanation of the poetry. It's not the definitive one. And he wrote the poetry. But of course, the poetry is also a gift from God. It's given him. And he recognizes that no prose explanations, even his own, can ever exhaust the fullness that's been given him in grace, that he then tried to express in the poetry. So you've got a kind of three-stage process here, from the inner experience that he had in prison, which was both horrible torture, but also this amazing consolation given him by God. Then he felt he had to express it, so he writes it out in these wonderful poems, and then he takes the poems with him in a little book, we're told, when he escapes. Then he begins teaching the poems, and then the sons say, well, try to explain it further to us. So I think that's an important aspect of the kind of, first of all, process, and then the open-endedness of the great mystics. And John of the Cross would be a perfect example of that.
And his poetry is I didn't realize this until quite recently, that his poetry is regarded as, part of the great poetry of the Spanish literary tradition, not only the religious or spiritual,
right, and the world, I think, in the world. And that's, of course, also interesting. The poetry is very popular in his own lifetime, but then for several centuries, it's the prose works that are really read. And the rediscovery of John's poetry is another late 19th century, 20th century phenomenon. And all to the good, of course. So now we can take the poetry and the prose and feed them off against each other. Both sides are necessary for fully understanding John. Just as in the case with Meister Eckhart that I talked about. Eckhart is the first major mystical theologian who writes both in the technical learned language of the schools in Latin, but also preaches in the new vernacular, the Middle High German. And some Eckhart scholars would say, oh, it's the German Eckhart, because it's so creative, the language, and the Latin is dead. No, you really have to understand Eckhart by looking at both the Latin works and the Middle High German works and seeing how they interact, even though the Middle High German sermons may be much more lively in a certain sense. The theological meat of these is often expressed in the Latin treatises. So you need both the Latin and the German. In case of John of the Cross, you need both the poetry and the long prose commentaries.
Do you think the writing, the expression of mystical theology has got more complex over the centuries because of, I don't know, our the growth of human knowledge through science and intercultural encounters? If you take something like in the desert tradition, the theme of Achadia, that speaks, I think, to everyone who has any kind of spiritual practice and who's learning to meditate, that you go through cycles of dryness and impatience with oneself, or irritability, and you want to give it up and do something else. So, but it's a fairly simple description of that cycle, from Achadia to apatheia to agape, and then almost the cycle begins again. There's progress, but there's a cycle of progress. But then with John of the Cross, you have the Dark Night, which is actually not I recommend that treatise on the Dark Night for anyone who's feeling depressed. Because it cheers you up. Don't you find?
It also tells you the difference between depression and the Dark Night.
Yes.
Because many people, there are certain, you might say, psychological similarities between the two, but if you read it very carefully, you'll see that some of it may look like depression, but it's not. It has another aspect to it that could be the aspect that cheers you up in that sense, because you recognize
because you know that it has some purpose.
Yes, it has a purpose. It's within the context of a wider picture. Does mystical literature and mystical discourse get more complicated? I don't really think so, because I think mystical literature or mystical discourse, however we want to frame it, is a lot more like art and poetry than it is like science. And science has a definite progression. Our moderns, great as Newton was, we know a lot more about the universe than Newton knew. And in another 50 years, people will know a lot more about the universe than we know today. So there's a definite curve within science that I don't think exists in, if you will, in the humanities and the religious humanities. That is an artistic masterpiece, like take Homer or Virgil. It is still a masterpiece, although our world is much more complicated. And very few mystical works have more complexity and depth to them than these Dionysian writings.
Yes.
For example, or than Meister Eckhart. We do have contemporary figures who make use of those themes. They'll use them in a new way because our context is a new context. The point I was making the other day about we can't just repeat the past, but we take things from the past, we take aspects, we take themes out of this literature and try to use them as we express the same or similar truths within a new context. So we have to use the world in which we're living, and we have to address that world. But I don't think that we're necessarily, getting more complicated about it or taking it to a new level of profundity. Because the level of profundity with mystical discourse doesn't have a bottom. And so no matter how deep you go, you're still infinitely separated from the divine infinity. That's a great mystical theme that Gregory of Nyssa first makes explicit. It's called epektasis, constantly stretching forward towards the infinite God, and finding great fruition and joy in that constant stretching out, but also realizing a kind of frustration because there's still an infinite direction, it's still an infinite distance to go. And for Gregory of Nyssa and others, that's going to be as true in heaven as it is here.
Yes.
So and it's based on a text in Paul, Philippians 3:13, constantly stretching out to God. And although Gregory is the first to make it, as I said, in an explicit way, most mystical writers, even before Gregory and certainly after Gregory, even though they don't use the same word in the same categories, they have the same thing. It's an endless journey that's both infinitely rewarding and yet keeps you on the move because there's more to go.
So it just keeps getting better and better, like your lectures.
I haven't given the last one yet, so be careful. It might be a bomb.
What do you think about I think I mentioned to you the other day a conversation I had with Raimon Panikkar.
Oh, my old friend.
He's a great old friend of yours, and great Spanish-Indian theologian and contemplative and scholar, great and amazing scholar. He used to say, if somebody would introduce him as being half Spanish and half Indian, he would say, no, I'm 100% Spanish and 100% Indian. But towards the end of his life, well, no, actually not towards the end of his life, when he was in his full glory, I asked him, did you ever, I think he was never challenged by Rome, because I don't think anyone dared to challenge him intellectually. But I asked him, did you ever feel that your intelligence got in the way of your own contemplative practice? And he sort of didn't have an academic career because he spent 6 months teaching and 6 months, I don't know, in ashrams or living in India. So he chose to live his life in that way. So I asked him, did your intelligence ever get in the way of your contemplative practice? And he said, no. I'm too intelligent to allow that to happen. So would you say the same about yourself?
I can't use the same line, though. I mean, but I believe in the truth of it. Panikkar was a wonderful representative, of course, of someone who lived two traditions. I mean, he was a Catholic, but he came out of a Hindu tradition, and the interaction between his connection, he wasn't bi-religious. If you asked him, he's a Catholic Christian, but his Catholic Christianity was deeply influenced by his Hindu background. And the meditations that he practiced was very much influenced by Hindu practices, etc. He was a truly, ecumenical figure in that sense, in terms of his own personality. And Ewart Cousins, my dear friend, was also a very good friend, a closer friend to Panikkar than I ever was. And I always thought Ewart Cousins was the one who introduced the term global spirituality, that we live in an era of global spirituality, even though we might belong to particular traditions, be they Christian or Hindu or Jewish or Muslim. The recognition of that global situation in which we live religiously, a place of global spirituality, seems to me to be of vital importance for where we're going in the 21st century. And I've always wondered if Ewart kind of created that term as a reflection of his conversations with Raimon Panikkar.
It makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, it would make sense, because Panikkar was a global person with his knowledge of spiritual traditions, his working to bring these traditions together, his insights into how that might happen or not happen. You didn't have to always agree with him. There are a lot of things that Panikkar and I used to argue about, but that was his intention. That's where he was moving. And I think that's a very important paragon, image, model for where it has to go today.
Sure. Yes. Question that is often asked, and I think it reflects even the trouble that Meister Eckhart had with the Pope on that question of the nature of prayer, which is when the balance between those elements, those three elements of religion, is lost, then the institutional, for example, becomes repressive of the contemplative, and that creates, generally a dysfunctional personality in the church. But it's very strong, and it can lead to a lot of anger and a lot of pain and suffering. But so a question that sort of addresses that, which is the question of the 21st century, really, is often raised, is it the same experience with if a Buddhist meditates, or a Christian or a Jew or a Sufi or a Hindu? Is it the same experience? Are they going to the same place? And it seems to me, be interested to know your response to this, that we have to say ultimately, from a Christian point of view, we believe there is one God. So, yes, we do go to the same place. That's quite disturbing, I think, for some institutional mentalities, because it means we don't have the monopoly, or we're not controlling access to this experience. But then, so I personally, that's how I would say, yes, we must go to the same place. There is one God. And that also explains why people sharing a contemplative orientation and practice across different traditions can get on much better with each other than they can with people of a more repressive or orientation in their own faith tradition. So I don't know if you would resonate with that. And then, how would you describe the difference then? Where the difference must come in interpretation and language, how we describe this experience, what it means to us, how we, incarnate it and support it in daily life, and the kind of community we're living in, all of that. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah. Well, one of the most difficult questions, theoretical questions about mysticism over the last 50 or 60 years has been, whether what's called sometimes the essentialist position, that all mystical experience is ultimately one, or the alternate camp, and this is conducted mostly among philosophers, a kind of constructivist position, that the different mysticisms are constructed within different religious and social contexts, and that really are different. That debate has gone on and on and on. my own take on that would be a variation on, Lawrence, what you just said. I think we all are aiming in the same direction. We all are aiming towards the same goal, but we're taking different directions that are historically conditioned by the faith traditions in which we live. That goal, however, is an eschatological goal. It ain't here yet. So that when the different traditions have different experiences of God, moments of consciousness, these are very much conditioned by the faith and historical situations in which they are. But I think an argument can be made, theologically and perhaps even philosophically, that the goal intended in the long range, in the eschaton, is one and the same goal. So I don't see it as actually happening here. I think there are too many differences among the moments.
No.
There's great similarities in terms of practice and in terms of certain values.
And fruits, by their fruits you will know them.
Exactly, but I hesitate to say, oh, it's all the same.
Yeah.
That's the crude essentialist position. Yeah. All the mystics are experiencing the same thing, they just explain it in different ways. I think that's far too simplistic. But the total constructivist position is also incorrect. You know, that they're all totally, it's what, you know, it's basically what in the Middle Ages used to be called nominalism. You know, everything is just a name. There's no real unity. But the unity, if it does exist, and I believe it does, is the unity of an eschatological goal of all the religions. So we got to wait.
Well, and we have to keep the two arguments balanced in a way, because the Dalai Lama says on occasions, my religion is kindness.
Yeah.
You can't argue with that.
Yes.
You know? And he says if your religion doesn't make you a nicer person, then there's something wrong with you or the religion. And then, on the other hand, on another occasion, he will say, I think Buddhism is the best religion for me.
Yeah. Okay.
And that is also quite disturbing, I think, to a certain kind of religious mind, because it seems to subject certainly to a Christian, sort of a certain type of Christian evangelical mind, perhaps, because it seems too subjective and relativistic. But in another way, it can't be denied, because most people, maybe this is changing in a secularized society, but most people follow a religious tradition that is compatible with the culture they're born in.
Yes. Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
And even if, like, Buddhism is brought into Western or Californian culture, it becomes it becomes Californian after a while, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
So it's very, very different. You know, Thai Buddhism is very different. So we presume, as there is a cultural evolution taking place, and our global, unless everything shuts down and we no longer have the internet and we no longer have travel, this globalization of culture, or familiarity of culture and interaction at a faster and faster rate is happening.
Yeah.
It's accelerating change. Where do you see that leading in terms of a mystical, common mystical culture?
Yeah. I'm not sure it's leading to a common mystical culture. When I use the phrase global Christianity or global spirituality, it would be the recognition of the fact that today religious traditions know more about each other than they ever had in the past. They're trying to overcome the hatreds and the tensions of the past with great difficulty, as we see on the level of the fundamentalisms. For me, ecumenism involves primarily a respect for the integrity of another tradition and the mutual respect that traditions should have among themselves. And that's occurring. It's difficult, but it is occurring. It's certainly greater now than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and let alone 500 years ago in most cases. So one needs to take that sense of the integrity of another religion and try not to colonize any other religious tradition. I mean, for all that I like Karl Rahner very much, You know, Rahner's notion of the anonymous Christian can be insulting to people who aren't Christians.
Or the hidden.
Yeah, you know, a Jewish scholar might say, I don't want to be an anonymous Christian. I want to be a good Jew. And they'd have every right, you know, to make that point. In other words, the mutual understanding and attempt to collaborate with others doesn't mean that you have to agree on everything, but it means you have to agree to work together insofar as you can and respect the real differences. And those differences, I think, exist among the mystical traditions as well. But we have to keep talking, and we have to keep working towards greater mutual cooperation and respect for each other. So is there a common mysticism in the future? I don't see it. And would it be good even? I'm not sure.
Well, not a common religion, maybe. But I mean, Panikkar changed the title of one of his books, didn't he? The Hidden Christ of Hinduism.
Yeah.
He changed the title later on, or rewrote it, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
But I wonder whether the ecumenism is just about respect. What I've learnt from the interreligious dialogue that I've done, and when we do it in the community, we always incorporate you know, a common meditation period into the time of dialogue, which I find changes the chemistry, the mood, and the way you relate to the people you're talking with and dialoguing with. But so is it just about, and when you do that, I think it's more than just being respectful of the other person, the integrity of the other person's tradition. You are actually pushed towards the point where you try, or you're willing to see reality from the other person's point of view. Yeah. And that can be quite scary, because if you can see from another person's point of view, how do you know when you come back to your own point of view that you will still be holding it?
No, I fully agree with that, and that's a nice extension of you know, my first point about mutual respect. There is a further dimension, and the further dimension is to try as far as possible to get in the other person's shoes and see why they believe and act the way they do. And I just had one addendum to that too. It's much easier to share practices, particularly practices like meditation, with other religious traditions that have a similar dynamic and a similar kind of practical side. My friend Basil Pennington, now deceased, who is one of the pioneers, as many of you know, of centering prayer. Basil not only spent time as a Western monk on Mount Athos with the Eastern monks, but he also spent time in India living with Hindu monks. And he wrote little books on both of those practices. And he once told me that when he first went to live with Indian monks, it was a very strange world, but as they went into meditation and their meditation practices, he felt completely at home. Yes. So it was the practical side of monastic meditation where Basil felt, yes, I belong here in a way. And so the practical orthopraxis or praxis is in a certain sense at least as important as trying to talk about our different beliefs, orthodoxies, orthodoxy and its various manifestations.
Great. Just before we open up to other people's questions or comments, I don't know if you came across the work of a British neurologist and psychiatrist called Ian McGilchrist.
I have not.
He's written a very long, interesting book, some 20 years actually, as Rowan Williams introduced me to, and it's a synthesis of the work that's been done in the last 20 years on discovering how the two hemispheres of the brain work. And he's not a religious person at all. He's not anti-religious, but he's not religious. And he came to speak at our center recently because I think what he's saying actually is offers a very interesting commentary or metaphor, you know, through science. Science, I think, offers metaphors for us of some ancient wisdom. And basically he's, you know, describing how the two hemispheres of the brain work together, contemplation and action, as you were talking about the other day, or Martha and Mary, or the apophatic and the cataphatic. that he says the two hemispheres of the brain work together in all the major functions of consciousness, but there is a world of difference between them.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but that the right hemisphere, which is the contemplative, you would say the Mary dimension, has priority. You know, Mary has chosen the better part, Jesus says. So I wondered how you feel. Obviously science can't and shouldn't try to explain or justify mystical wisdom. On the other hand, as you were saying, modern science is getting closer and closer to some of the language and intuitions of mystical traditions, the idea of relationship, overcoming of duality, the idea of union, and so on. So these, do you see this as, I'm sure, do you see this as offering us proof, or simply that the distance between science and religion, or these two hemispheres of the brain, is decreasing in some way?
I guess it depends on the scientists, because there are some scientists who are still very strongly opposed to religion, who think of it as superstition. There are other scientists who recognize that science itself is a progression, it has its limitations, it has its fuzzinesses, and who talk almost as if they're mystics when they begin talking about the deepest truths with regard to the universe, that they may not be able to prove scientifically, but that are kind of intuitions that they've been led to. So I see certain scientists, and there's big literature on this, Brian Swim and other people like that who've written about the relationship.
Ken Wilber.
And Ken Wilber and various others. It's not something I read very widely in myself, but I try to keep abreast of what they're talking about. And there is a sense with those scientists who are very adventurous thinkers, who begin to talk in language that sounds very similar to mysticism, and that is often open to the deepest riches in the in the contemplative tradition, but they're not all the scientists talk like that. There are certain very famous scientists and legitimately famous scientists who I think have blinkers when it comes to anything religious. Unfortunate blinkers, but they're there.
Wilber claims that all the great scientists of the 20th century ended up with a mystical view of the universe, and he wrote put together an anthology of that to illustrate that.